Hi, everyone. Welcome back. We're doing another pre-recorded lecture today. So let me go ahead and share my screen so we can get through this material. Yes. Okay. Pretty sure you should be able to see this. I'm always paranoid, especially when I do these pre-recorded lectures, that we are actually seeing what we need to see. Yes. So let's make it big. Okay. So I've made it all the way through the course, and we are finally today going to be talking about the angiosperms. Finally, right? Finally, we've made it to the flowering plants, which is pretty cool. It's been a long journey, but we have finally gotten here. Before we jump into that, just a few reminders. So you have an assignment due, last assignment of the semester. Assignment 6 is due by 10 a.m. on Thursday. And maybe more importantly, just a reminder, as I said in the announcements on Canvas, your lecture exam 2 is actually 1 week from today on the 19th. And lecture exam 2 is going to cover the ferns, the seed plant introduction, cycads, ginkgo, conifers, so lectures 10 through 16. As I said in a Canvas announcement, lecture 17, which was the campus tree walk, is kind of going to be material that's used to supplement lab. So it won't specifically be covered on the lecture exam 2. And in case you haven't checked it out, there is a study guide that has been available on Canvas since the 7th. So it's been there for a while now. And definitely check that out to make your study material if you haven't yet, right? Okay. Another announcement or reminder, rather. Oh yeah, Phenology Assignment. Oh yeah, you've been taking photos every week, right? Well, it's the observation period of the Phenology Assignment ends this week. So this is the 6th week of observation. To take your final photos this week. And that means that you need to begin basically organizing your materials to submit for the Phenology Assignment, which is due in 2 weeks on the last day of class. So just a reminder, this is a very important assignment because it's actually worth 2 times the points of the normal homework assignments. And the full instructions of the Phenology Assignment are on Canvas, but so you can see where you're supposed to be right now. So here we are, we're all the way to step 7. We are approaching the end of the observation period. These are the things you need to do. You need to take all the photos that you have taken and organize them into 10 total PowerPoint slides, 1 for each tree. And each slide should show 7 photos of each tree, right? So 1 slide per tree, 10 slides total. And on each given slide, you will show how your tree has changed over the time, right? You're also going to make sure that all their data is input into an Excel file. And when you are finished organizing all of this material, you'll save your PowerPoint as a PDF. Please use this file name. Don't just send me Phenology Assignment because I'm going to get 40 of those. So to help me make sure I get yours, please use this file name. This is in the instructions on Canvas as well. And so you're going to send me the PDF file of your slides, and you're going to send me the Excel file, and please save your files as shown here. And both of those documents, the Excel file and the PDF, are due April 28th, the last day of class, no exceptions. You can turn it in anytime between the end of this week. Once your observation period is done, which is this week, you can turn it in anytime until April 28th. That's the official last day I'll accept them. Okay. Again, so just to kind of give you an idea of what your slides might look like. So here could be the example of one of your slides, right? You're gonna have 10 slides, 1 for each tree. And so here one of your slides might look like this, right? A photo on day 1 with you in the photo. If you followed the instructions. If you have any questions about that, feel free to email me. But see, one slide for all of the observations, right, of the same tree. One slide per tree. And your Excel file will look something like this, right? This is all available on Canvas, but I'm just reminding you that there's a format that you're supposed to be following. Okay, so full assignment descriptions on Canvas. It's been up there for over a month. Please follow those instructions. All right, last time we did a virtual field trip of the campus trees. And then today, or yesterday rather, you had a lab looking at some of those trees, some of the conifers from that virtual tour in more detail in real life. And today we're finally going to get into angiosperms, which is exciting. We'll talk about their habit, which is their form. We'll talk about their habitats, where they live, overall form in terms of parts of the plants. And then we'll introduce the flower, which is, we're talking about the flowering plants. And so we will talk about the flower. All right, so I always like to get oriented. We've left those non-vascular plants way back beginning of the semester. We're officially well into the vascular plants, in particular, the seed shedding vascular plants. We finished the gymnosperms, right? Those naked seed plants. Now we're finally going to get to the angiosperms, which is our last station stop, right? This is where the train's going to end, right? The end of the plant kingdom is the angiosperms. All right, we've seen this before, but just to keep it in mind, because some of you got this wrong on the first lecture exam. So the ovule and the seed are a great evolutionary leap for plants, such that the majority of plants that exist on Earth have seeds, right? So we've seen this slide now many, many times, but just to knock it home, right? In this pie chart here, green represents seed plants. And as you can see, the majority of the plants on Earth are seed plants. That lets us know that the ovule and the seed give plants a strong evolutionary advantage. Otherwise, the majority of plants on Earth wouldn't have ovules and seeds. It's the form that works best. If you have ovules and you have seeds, you do the best. And that therefore we have the most diversification there. Okay. If we were to take that green part of the pie and look just at the green part, here we go. We would see that inside of the seed plants, the majority of the seed plants are angiosperms. So majority of plants on Earth are seed plants. And therefore, the majority of plants on Earth are flowering plants, because the majority of seed plants are flowering plants. So it's those flowering plants that dominate the plant kingdom. Gymnosperms, there's only about 11,000 species. Flowering plants, there's close to 370,000, right? So the majority of plants on Earth are flowering plants. Really important plants. You might recall we did this during the last few lectures of the gymnosperms. So there's two types of seed plants. There's the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. The gymnosperms have naked seeds and ovules that are also technically naked, in that the ovules are not enclosed in an ovary. The ovules are visible to your naked eye. They are exposed to the environment. Here are some examples that we covered in previous lectures. Right on the left, two pictures, we have examples from the cycads, and on the right the left two pictures, we have pictures from the cycads, right? Here's an ovule, here's a bunch of ovules, 1, 2, 3, etc. You can see them with your naked eye, right? Here's another ovule example from the cycads. This here are the ovules of ginkgo. And on a cone, oops, that didn't draw well. And if you look on a cone, right, ovules. So these are ovules that are not enclosed in an ovary. They are visible to the naked eye. Once they become fertilized, these seeds will also be naked or visible to the naked eye, right? Okay. This is old news now. We already know the gymnosperms. Now let's talk the angiosperms. The angiosperms, opposite from the gymnosperms, have ovules that are enclosed in an ovary. And so their ovules are not exposed to the environment. And eventually, when those ovules become fertilized, the seeds will also not be exposed. The seeds will be inside of a fruit. So this is different from the gymnosperms. We saw this slide when we first became aware of ovules in plants. On the left, you see a gymnosperm ovule. On the right, you see angiosperm ovule. And the gymnosperm ovule, I guess I'll use black, right? This is the, well, that's part of the ovule, but this whole thing is a ovule and it's not inside of anything, right? Whereas in the angiosperms, here's the ovule. And yes, it's inside of this structure called the ovary. See? Ovule is contained in an ovary in the flowering plants. All right, so let's talk about these flowering plants. So we've been saying the angiosperms, which is totally correct. You have gymnosperm and angiosperm, totally correct. But just like the gymnosperms had different phyla inside, right? In the gymnosperms, you had Cycadophyta, Coniferaophyta, etc., Gingophyta. In the angiosperms, you also have phyla. Well, actually, in the angiosperms, you only have one phylum. Gymnosperms, we had several. Angiosperms, you only have one, which is easier. And that phylum name is Magnoliophyta. Magnoliophyta, it says it there at the top of the slide. Sometimes you may see online or in the book or in other sources, Anthophyta. I'm not going to go into that right now, but for the purposes of this class, we're going with Magnoliophyta, okay? Magnoliophyta is the name of the angiosperm phylum. And this phylum name is based on a genus called Magnolia, which right now in spring, if you are walking around New Jersey, New York, you probably are seeing some magnolia in flower right now because this is the time of year that they flower. But yeah, Magnoliophyta comes from this genus name, Magnolia. Magnolia happens to be one of the earliest flowering plants. All the members of the phylum Magnoliophyta bear flowers. So every single species that's in the phylum Magnoliophyta will bear flowers, hence why they're called the flowering plants. And just as we just covered on the previous slides, right? Flowering plants are plants whose ovules are inside of ovaries. Later, the seeds are inside of fruits. All right, tons of diversity in the angiosperms, as you may be aware, right? If you think of flowers on Earth, you've probably seen many different shapes, sizes, colors, different smells, right? Maybe you have a favorite flower, but there are tons and tons. I mean, there's almost 370 species of flowering plant. So there's quite a bit of diversity in flower shape and form, right? So I just said. Before we kind of jump into that diversity, we should first look at the significance that the evolution of flowering plants had on other organisms in the world. So we saw, remember we talked about this, I think when we first started talking about the ovule, right? Here you have the early vascular plants appearing around 410 million years ago, right? Then you start to see the first seed plants occur. First seed plants meaning things like conifers, things like ginkgo, things like cycads, right? First seed plants appearing. And around that time, we start to see a diversification of animal life, which we've talked about. But when the flowering plants show up around 130 million years ago in the fossil record, that's when we see a big explosion in terms of diversification of animal form. So you see here, first flowering plants around 130 million years ago. And, you know, shortly thereafter, shortly meaning many, many millions of years later, but in evolutionary time, pretty short, we begin to see things like the very first mammals in the fossil record, tons of diversity, and ultimately leading up to humans, since that seems to be the species we care the most about, right? So as when the flower showed up, in terms of when the flower evolved and plants began making flowers, we see a big increase in animal diversity. All right. What is a flower? What is a flower? So remember I said every species that's in the phylum Magnoliophyta makes flowers. So you can think of the flower as the phylum characteristic, right? Kind of like when I said with the conifers, right? Coniferophyta was the name of the phylum the conifers are in, and everything that's in Coniferophyta bears cones, right? Every species. So for phylum Magnoliophyta, the phylum characteristic is the flower. Every species will bear a flower. And a flower is a specialized shoot system whose leaves have been modified over time for reproduction. So they're part of the shoot system. Do I show it here? No, I don't. If you go back when we first started, I think it was Introduction to the Vascular Plants, so probably lecture 4. We're talking about the shoot system, the root system, that kind of stuff. So the flower is part of that shoot system, right? The above ground part. And flower's job, so you see it's a specialized shoot system whose leaves are modified for reproduction. So we know then that we have to deal with sex structures, right? If we're dealing with reproduction. So flowers bear sexual reproductive structures, and the male structures, there's some scary words here, but I'm totally fine if you use the not so scary words, but just so you see the words, because you'll see them in other materials like your book. There's male structures and there's female structures. Male structures are called androsium, but the easier term is stamens. I'm totally fine with stamens. Female structures are called gynosium, and the less scary word is carpels. So male structures, stamens, female structures, carpels is totally fine. Okay. Angiosperms. So we know, what did we know? Very diverse. Their diversity helped animal diversity increase on Earth. It's kind of like a feedback system of plants make stuff for animals, animals consume things on the plants and kind of become diverse together. And every species in the phylum has a flower, and on the flower there will be male structures and female structures, right? Okay. Remember I said there's like 370,000-ish species of angiosperm, right? Of flowering plants. Where are those found? Well, they're found they're the dominant type of plant pretty much everywhere on Earth. So if you think of the tropical rainforest or a desert or on mountains, pretty much the majority of the plants that you see there are going to be flowering plants. That's what this says here. Angiosperms dominate land flora in almost every ecosystem. Almost every ecosystem, because when we were learning about another plant in the seed plants, right? There's a type of ecosystem that is shown on this slide in purple called the circumboreal forest. And we learned in a previous lecture that a different type of plant is dominant there. So go back to the other seed plant. If this doesn't seem familiar to you, go back to some of the other lectures we had on the seed plants and figure out which thing dominated those forests. But aside from those forests, aside from those shown purple here, all the other colors here are where the angiosperms are the most abundant plant. Okay. We know angiosperms are super important for not only all the animals on Earth, but also us, right? In the very, very first class that we had this semester, we learned about how plants are food for humankind and the foundation of human civilization, and that it was the domestication of plants that allowed us to build civilizations and stop hunter-gathering, right? And we talked about in the very first class, there are multiple domestication events all occurring around 10,000 years ago that allowed civilizations to be built. And yep, you might have guessed where this is going, but these staples of civilizations that allowed us to, these food products that we domesticated and allowed us to build civilization, a lot of them come from the angiosperms. And in fact, the three that we covered in that very first lecture, rice, wheat, and corn, come from grasses, and grasses are members of the flowering plants. Yep. So angiosperms feed the world. You might remember this slide from the very first lecture, right? Yeah. And notice rice, wheat, and corn are fruits from grasses, right? Which we call caryopsis. Anytime, the only thing that can have fruit, I gotta move this thingy, right? You can't have a fruit unless you had a flower. We'll learn more about that in the next few lectures, but fruit is a characteristic, just like the flower is a characteristic of the flowering plants, so is the fruit, because the flower will become the fruit. Okay. We use angiosperms, so just like we built civilizations on these very important angiosperm crops, we use angiosperms for all of our food products, really. I mean, like the vast majority of our food products come from the angiosperms. Some examples here are, you know, your rice, wheat, corn, all of the fruits that you call fruits, right? Vegetables, oils, herbs, spices, even things like beer and wine, those all come from the angiosperms. So these are covering how we use angiosperms, meaning their economic importance. So food is one way. We also use angiosperms to build shelters using lumber, which comes from wood of angiosperm trees. And also we use bamboo, as I've told you before, as a grass, and palms to build houses. Other ways they're economically important are to be used for clothing. So cotton, linen, hemp are all from angiosperms. A lot of the dyes that we use are from angiosperms, and particularly flowers make a lot of pigments that we can use for dyes. Fuel, so we heat our homes and cook using the wood from angiosperms. We make drinks out of them. We make medicine and drugs out of them. We give flowers to people that we like, right? By buying them at the grocery store or wherever, and a lot more, right? And a lot more other things, but they're very economically important to humans, the flowers. All right. Now we're going to talk about their form. So, or their habit, right? We've come across this word before a few times in the course of this class. Let's change colors to, I guess, dark blue, right? Oops, I gotta move this, right? Habit or form, habit or form. So the angiosperm sporophytes have a lot of different types of habits depending on the species. One habit is called herbs. So you may have heard the word herb before when you've maybe been cooking something, right? Well, I need some basil, I need some oregano, right? But herbs doesn't just mean those aromatic things you use to cook with. Herbs are a bunch of different types of plants, and it basically means that the plant is non-woody. So if a plant is not going to make wood, no wood, right? See, non-woody, we call that plant an herb. An herb. And you should already be knowing this because we covered it. But remember, wood, as you and I know it, is really secondary xylem, right? We covered that in the ginkgo lecture, as well as conifer lecture, as well as cycad lecture. So wood is basically secondary xylem. So herbaceous plants or herbs don't have secondary xylem. So this is like short, little, soft kind of different plants, right? Like if you try to like break them with your hand, you would notice very easily there's no wood inside, right? They're herbaceous. So in addition to herbs, the angiosperms also have shrubs. Shrubs are able to get woody, but they tend to be kind of short. So shrubs are kind of like little trees almost. Most people agree that a shrub would be something that can be anywhere from 2 to 12 feet tall, but never gets quite as big as like a tree. So a rose bush, for example, is a type of a shrub. Other angiosperm species are trees, right? Which also can get woody. And then the last type of habit that you may encounter are vines, aka lianas. Lianas are the proper name, but basically vines are these things that kind of hang down or grow along the ground. And I always say, like, with vines, like there was the, man, I might be dating myself, but like, you know, like Tarzan, like swing from a vine. So the vine has to support a person, right? So they are capable of making wood. So vines are able to make woods, aka lianas. All right, and this is what I just said. Shrubs, trees, and lianas are woody in that they do make secondary xylem, unlike the herbs, right? The herbs don't make that. Okay. So those are kind of general habits, right? Herbs, shrubs, trees, vines. But there's a few other habits that we've also talked about, and they will further describe the plants in a better way. So you may be epiphytic, which is a term we've covered before, and that refers to your ability to grow on other plants, right? So some epiphytic plants might be herbaceous, some epiphytic plants might be woody. It will depend on the epiphytic plant. Another habit is aquatic habit. Some of those might be only herbaceous. Some of those might be woody. And then parasitic plants. So parasitic plants are usually non-woody. I don't think I've ever seen a woody parasitic plant. So they're mostly herbaceous. But what makes them cool is they lack the green pigment chlorophyll. So they cannot make their own food. They have to get food from other plants. And so what they do is they use these special roots, which will grow in to other plant roots, and they'll basically steal sugars from the other plants, and hence why we call them parasitic plants. This species here is commonly known as ghost pipe, and it actually does occur in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut region. So you may have seen this and thought, oh, that's, I think, a mushroom, but believe it or not, this is an example of parasitic plant. And as I said, they lack chlorophyll, which is a green pigment, and that pigment is needed to make food using photosynthesis. And as you can see, this is not green, it's white, and so that's why they can't do photosynthesis. They have to steal their food. This is another example of a parasitic plant. This one does not occur in New Jersey, New York area, but still super cool to include. This plant is called the corpse lily. It's actually the largest single flower on Earth. And remember, this word extant just means not extinct, right? Still on Earth, not extinct, extant. It's the largest single flower on Earth. This whole thing is one flower. It can be like, I think about 3 to 4 feet wide, give or take. A common name is the corpse lily because it actually smells kind of like rotting flesh. Which, believe it or not, a lot of flowers actually do rely on that aroma as their way. And you may be unsurprised to find out that they are actually fly pollinated. So the flies are attracted by that stinky kind of rotting fleshy smell. And so they will be attracted to the plant and then they'll serve to pollinate it. All right. All right. So the flowering plants, they're the most abundant plant on Earth. Every species in the flowering plant bears a flower. The diversification of the flowering plants allowed for diversification of animals, also allowed for the building of civilizations of humans. And there are a lot of different habits that these flowering plants can have, right? That's what we've covered so far. Now let's go into the habitats. So habitat is not to be confused with habit. Habit means form. Habitat means where it lives. So there's angiosperms, as I said in the slide that showed the whole world, and I told you that they're the most dominant plant in almost every ecosystem. So you may expect here that we're going to see quite a few habitats where angiosperms live. So they live and are dominant in the temperate and tropical forests, as shown here. They live in the desert. Members, I think we covered the xero prefix here in the conifers, right? But just to remind you, remember, this xero means dry. So xerophytic refers to dry environments like deserts and sand dunes. Yeah, we covered that in the conifers. Angiosperms also are found in the grasslands and savannas. Look, aw, right? Oh, little guy. Alpine regions, which are mountain regions. Look at all those flowers. Beautiful, right? It's where you'll find angiosperms. Freshwater environments, like a little freshwater pond. Maybe you've seen like water lilies and things like that. Saltwater environments. So maybe you've been down to Florida or the tropics or Central or South America, and you've been along the coast and have seen plants growing in the ocean, right? For example, these mangroves. Those are examples of flowering plants. All right. So now we know what the forms look like. Now we know where we can find them. So now let's talk about the actual parts of these plants a bit. So we are in the vascular plants. We know, therefore, then the sporophyte generation is dominant and long-lived, right? This is no-brainer at this point because we've covered that so many times in the cycads, conifers, ginkgo, same deal, right? Vascular plant, so it has true root stems and leaves. Sporophyte generation dominant. This is kind of like a cartoon of the basic structure of a angiosperm sporophyte plant. So you have a shoot system. Oh, this is kind of what I was talking about before. Yeah. You have a shoot system and you have a root system, right? The shoot system, I thought maybe I drew around it, but just to show you here. So here, shoot system. Shoot system is everything that's above the ground, right? So what's in the shoot system? Stems, right? Stems, leaves, flowers, Those are all parts of the shoot system. Some of these terms we've come across before, right? So if you're looking at the stems, stems have internodes and nodes, just like we've seen before, right? Here's the stem, here's a stem right here. There are nodes, right? Nodes, the stem, and the space between those nodes are the internodes. Covered that already. The leaves, so this is all terms we've already covered. These are not new terms, right? The leaves have petioles and blades or lamina. So here is a single leaf, right? Stem part of a leaf is the petiole. The green flat part of this leaf is the blade or the lamina. This is stuff words we already know, right? There are buds. So there's an apical bud, which I think we'll talk about in a little bit. But so there's an apical bud here at the tip, which is at the tip, apical bud. It's going to be your location of primary growth. Look, here's another one on this tip. And then there will be axillary buds, which will produce branches. And I don't know if we covered it before, but just so you know, the reason why it's called axillary bud, so the space between the petiole and the stem is called an axil. And so that's why we say this bud is located right here. So that's why we call it an axillary bud. Sometimes people say auxiliary, but that's not really right. It's axillary because it's in the axil of this leaf. So see, buds and axils of leaves produce branches. That's where a branch will come out eventually when we're doing secondary growth. And then the root system is below, and I think we talk about that in a second. So first, just as I was trying to highlight on the previous slide, whenever we're thinking growth, you know you're dealing with primary growth and maybe secondary growth depending on the species. So this should be somewhat review, but if not, I'll walk through a bit. So this is that same picture as the previous slide, right? Same picture, but I'm drawing your attention to this axillary bud, or sorry, this apical bud, right? Remember, there's another one here. If you were going to look at a cross section through the apical bud, that's where the apical meristem is located. And you may recall that's where all of your primary growth tissues are going to be made. So do I color it? No, I don't. This is how you should try to organize your thoughts, right? So primary growth makes, all right, so let's go back for a second. So apical bud has in it apical meristem. Apical meristem is responsible for primary growth. So apical meristem is going to make primary meristems, and the primary meristems are going to make primary tissues. Whether the primary, so whether that apical meristem is in the tip of a shoot or the tip of the root, the primary meristems that the apical meristem makes are the same, and the primary tissues that those primary meristems make are the same. So this here is showing us the apical meristem of the shoot, right? Right here, located in this apical bud. And if we look at it under the microscope slide, here you go. Here is the apical meristem. And that apical meristem is going to divide via mitosis to make the primary meristems. We've learned about them before, but in case you need a reminder, the primary meristems are the protoderm, the procambium, and the ground meristem. Those are all going to be made by the apical meristem at the tip. So that's what it looks like if you're in the shoot. But if you were to look at the root, you would see the same players. I guess I'll use white here. Look, root apical meristem located right here. And what do apical meristems make? Primary meristems. Here they are. Protoderm, ground meristem, procambium. See, primary meristems. So it doesn't matter if you're looking at the shoot apical meristem or the root apical meristem, they're still going to give rise to the same primary meristems. This is a recall slide way, way back, I think in lecture 4 or 5, when we first encountered this. And just so you don't forget, right? This is what I was just saying. Apical meristem gives rise to the primary meristems. There are 3 of them: protoderm, ground meristem, procambium. Each of those primary meristems give rise to primary tissues. Protoderm, so this is a refresh, right? This is a recall. Protoderm makes epidermis. Ground meristem makes all of the ground tissues, parts of the cortex, parts of the pith, things like that. And then the procambium makes primary xylem, primary phloem. All right, this is a recall slide. Specifically in the angiosperms, let's see, how do I, yeah, okay. When we covered this before, we just kind of talked like at the tissue level, but then we didn't ever really talk about the cells that make up those tissues. So we talked about that the apical meristem makes the primary meristems, and that the primary meristems makes primary tissue. But we didn't talk about, for example, like, what do the cells look like in the epidermis? What do the cells look like in the ground tissues? Or what do the cells look like of primary xylem and primary phloem? So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here. So if you look at the epidermis, that's what this scanning electron microscope is showing you. Microscope slide. You'll see this kind of appearance. And you'll almost always, especially if you're on the lower part of the epidermis, don't worry about that though. The parts of the epidermis, you have these single layer of cells that have a cuticle, and you will see stomatal apparatuses, stomatal apparati, as part of the epidermis as well, right? And we covered that back, but just in case you need a reminder, like one stomatal apparatus is 2 guard cells, right? 2 guard cells and a hole in the middle of the stoma. All right. The ground tissues, there's a bunch of different cell types. There's parenchyma cells, which serve to do photosynthesis and store starch. And just so you know, parenchyma cells are by far the most common cell type in plants. Most common cell type. And you may have seen some of these terms in lab already, but you also might have seen collenchyma, which is supporting tissue cells, and then sclerenchyma, which is also supporting tissue cells, aka fiber cells in the angiosperms. And they contain this thing called lignin. I don't really care if you know about that so much. Just so you know, though, like I said, parenchyma cells, most abundant cell type in plants. It's the type of cells that do photosynthesis and store starch. And then you have 2 types of supporting tissue, collenchyma and sclerenchyma, both that help support the plant. Okay. And then primary xylem and primary phloem. The primary xylem tissues in the angiosperms are made of vessel element cells and fiber cells. The primary phloem tissue in the angiosperm is made up of seed tube element cells and companion cells. And we will talk about this more in a future class. Yeah, but you remember in the conifers where we kind of talk about tracheids, this is the new type of cells that we have to deal with in the angiosperms. Don't worry about this too much for today. We're going to go through this cell, the stuff that I care about in terms of these cells. We'll go over it a bit more, particularly this part. We'll go into great detail on a later date. All right, today I mostly want to introduce you to the flower. That's the main part of today. And let's see how I'm doing. Oh yeah, good. We're almost done. So remember I said the flower is the phylum characteristic, right? Every angiosperm species will make a flower. And I said that the flower is a specialized shoot system in that the leaves are modified for reproduction. And on a flower, you'll have sexual reproductive structures. You'll have male structures, female structures, AKA stamens for the male. Change colors to black, right? Stamens for the males, carpels for the female structures, and you may see the word pistil on occasion too. I apologize, right? Like already it's confusing. We have androsium and stamens. I already told you I'm okay with just stamens. You don't have to worry about androsium. For the female structures, you have gynosium, and I already told you I'm okay with carpels, right? But you will on occasion see this word pistil for anything that I give you, like an exam or an assignment or whatever. I will do this, pistil / carpels, just so you know. But I'm fine with these more simpler terms. And I didn't make up these things, right? Like I didn't make up pistils and carpels. These are just the terms as they are. Apologize for that. All right, so let's talk about the parts of a flower. So you have the pistil, AKA carpels, which is the female part. You have the stamens, which is the male part, and you have petals and you have sepals. These are the main parts of a flower. You may have even learned this in elementary school because they used to kind of go through that. Let's see, how do I go here? Yeah, so just so you're oriented. I guess I'll use bright blue. All right, so female part, pistils, AKA carpels. You can see that part here, right? And it's made up of these three things: a stigma, a style, and an ovary. We'll go into that in greater detail later. So female part, pistil, AKA carpels. Male part, stamens, which you can see there, this part here. And then petals, which is probably the thing you're most familiar with, right? The colorful part of a flower. And then sepals, which are, I don't know if you've ever bought a rose to give to somebody, but on the underside of the rose are like those little green leaves, right? Those are things called a sepal, shown here. Why I'm introducing you to these terms, pistil, AKA carpel, stamens, petals, and sepals, is because these are what are known as whorls of a flower. The flowers are arranged in whorls or circles, such that these individual whorls always occur in the same order. Doesn't matter what flower you're talking about. So I'll use pink because it probably show up better here. So the flower, the parts of a flower are arranged in whorls. So here on the left is like, if you're holding the flower, here on the right is as if we were to do a cross section through, actually it would be like this. A cross section through this and look at it under the microscope slide, which during the angiosperm lab, you will look at a slide like this. So first, let's just look at the one on the left, right? Because the one on the left is more similar to what I just showed you here, right? So before, when I drew it, and I'll use, I guess, blue again, I said there's the pistil, AKA carpels, right? That's in the middle. Then you have the stamens. That's the next thing. And then you have the petals, which you're most familiar with, and then the green little sepal, right? But these are actually arranged in what are called whorls. So if we do a cross section and look at it under the microscope slide, the outermost, well, let's start from the outermost whorl. So if you were to look at this flower on the left, what is the thing that's on the outside, right? And it's this green thing, and that's the sepal. And so if you're going to do cross section through a flower, right, the outermost whorl is the sepals, right? Whorls or circles. The next whorl is the petal, right, which is shown here. So under the microscope slide, there'll be another circle or whorl, which is the petals. The next whorl toward the inside is the stamen, right, shown here. So if you were to look at the cross section, the third whorl or circle would be the stamens. And then last but not least, on the innermost whorl of a flower is the female part, which is the carpels, aka pistil. So that's what I mean by the parts of a flower are arranged in whorls. And if you're looking at a flower, the whorls will always be in this order. Outermost whorl is always sepals, innermost whorl is always carpels, if the flower has all those parts. Okay. This is kind of better because you can see it. This is an actual flower as versus a drawing, right? This is an actual flower. Let's just talk about what the different parts do. So here, this is, I'll use red. So this is pistil, aka carpels. That's the female part. The parts of that are the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So the stigma, you can see right here, right? Just this little tip is the stigma. And the job of the stigma is to catch pollen. The stigma is attached to this long thing that's called the style. And the style's job is to hold the stigma out of the flower. And the style is a solid structure. It's not a hollow tube, but it's a solid structure that holds the stigma out of the flower. And the style is attached to the bottom part of the female portion, which is the ovary. And remember, we're in the flowering plant, so inside of that ovary is going to be where the ovules are. So female part of the flower, pistil, aka carpels, you have the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Right. This is just us saying you don't need to know the word gynosium. Pistils, aka carpels, fine. All right, male part of the plant. Male part of the flower. So male part of the flower, you have, they're called stamens. You have the anther, which is located here on this picture. The anther is what makes pollen. And similar to the style that extends the stigma out of the flower, the filament is this long strand that attaches to the anther and holds the anther out of the flower. So, female parts of the flower, pistil, aka carpels, which are made up of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Male part of the flower is the stamens, which is composed of the anther and the filament. And you don't need to know the word androsium. All right, Next whorl is the petals. Petals is what you're familiar with. Petals is the colorful part that attracts pollinators. If you were to talk about all the petals together, I guess I'll use a different color. I'll use purple. All the petals of a flower are called a corolla. So here's a petal, here's a petal, here's a petal. All three of those make up the corolla of this lily. And then the last whorl is the sepals. On this lily, the sepals look a lot like the petals in coloration, but notice they are a separate whorl. So I guess I'll use black, right? Sepals are the outermost whorl of the flower. And here they are here. Again, the lily looks a lot, the sepals look a lot like the petals. But if I were to draw it here, let's see, because I don't think I do it. Do I do it on the next? Let's see. Yeah, okay, almost done. But if I were to draw it here, it would be like this. So like here are the sepals of this lily. And then what color did I use for, I used that and that. I used purple, right? Here are the petals of this lily, the next whorl. Then the next whorl, I think I used blue. Yep, is the stamens, right? So here's a stamen. Here's a stamen. And then the last whorl, I think I used red or pink, I can't remember, is the pistil, aka carpels, right in the middle. So this is similar to that what I was showing you in the previous. If you were to do cross section through this, it would look like, and you looked at it under the microscope side, it looked like this. So here's the sepals, here's the petals, here is the stamens, and then the innermost whorl, the pistil, aka carpels, right? Okay. So some species of plant have all the whorls, right? Some species have all the whorls. So if you are a plant species that has all 4 whorls, we call the flowers complete. So complete flowers have all 4 whorls. I can draw, well, it's gonna be bad here, but just so you know, so like here's an example of a complete flower. It has the outermost whorl, which I should do, I guess, in white here, unfortunately, right? Which is the sepals. It has the petals. It has the stamens, right? Here's the stamens. And it has the pistil, aka carpels, right? So if a flower has all 4 whorls, we call it complete. If a flower is missing 1 or more whorls, we call that an incomplete flower. So for example, in this flower here, it is missing petals, it only has sepals, and the sepals look white. But yeah, so if you're missing petals, or if you're missing stamens, or if you're missing a pistil or carpels or sepals, you are an incomplete flower. Last thing, so okay, so right, parts of the flower, right? Parts of the flower are arranged in whorls. Pistil, aka carpel, is a female part made up of these parts. Stamens are the male parts made up of these 2 things, anther and filament. Next you have the petals, and then next you have the sepals. If the flower has all of those things, it's called a complete flower. If it's missing 1 or more of those things, it's called an incomplete flower. So when you think of the words complete versus incomplete, I want you to think of whorls. Whorls, 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 whorls. Complete flowers have all the whorls. Incomplete flowers are missing one or more whorls. As opposed to perfect and imperfect flowers. So these words, perfect and imperfect, refer to the sex structures. If a flower has both sex structures, we call it a perfect flower. So it has the male sex structures and female sex structures. We call that a perfect flower. Whereas an imperfect flower has either male or female sex structures. So don't get these confused, right? Complete and incomplete refer to whorls. Perfect and imperfect refer only to the whorls that deal with sex structures. If your flower only has male sex structures, you can call that flower staminate. Staminate from the word stamen, right? If the flower only has female sex structures with pistils, aka carpels, we can call it pistillate or carpellate. The reason why these terms are important is because if you're trying to identify a plant by its flowers, it's important to know whether or not the plant has flowers with all the whorls or only some of the whorls, whether the flower has male and female sex structures on one flower or on separate flowers. And notice, just so you know, should I go into that right now? Yes, because it's the last slide. I know this is confusing, but bear with me here. So complete and incomplete refer to the whorls. Perfect and imperfect refer to sex structures. And just keep in mind, right? If a plant is dioecious, right? Remember the term dioecious means sex structures in two separate houses, two separate plants. So if you're a flowering plant and you are a dioecious species, that means that on some plants, you'll have only male flowers. Oops. And on some plants, you'll have only female flowers. So if you have a dioecious species, you always have imperfect flowers. Always, 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 always. Yep. If you're a monoecious species, which is not on here, either you will have perfect flowers or on one plant, you'll have both types of imperfect flowers. Okay. You're probably thoroughly annoyed with any new vocabulary, but it's important for us to have these terms as we move forward through the angiosperms. So today we covered a little bit about the angiosperms, and we'll pick it up more next time. A lot of the terms that we came across today will be repeated there. And so there will be a lot of repetition per usual, so don't get too scared. Yep, don't forget to turn in your assignment that's due on Thursday. Don't forget to start studying for the exam. And yeah, I'll see you guys on Thursday. Bye.